Hello everybody, my name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, robot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about a double feature book review with two books from Thomas Godfrey. But before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do on this channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured, there are two ways to get up on here. Number one is through the Lamois, which is the monthly prompt contest here on the channel, where I give you guys a prompt, you respond to the prompt, send it in, and first Monday video of the month, we bask in your glory, ode to the mistakes. Number two is if you're an indie author and you have a book out or a book coming out, if you submit your first chapter and cover, they will be read here on the channel to hopefully help your book find new readers, because that is the bane of all of our existences, is just being seen. So hopefully that's a way to spread the love for books, even especially that are not necessarily my genre, because I know what I like, and that is not as varied as everybody writes. So we've got that. And number three, if you would like to read any of my books, they're available wherever you would like to get books. Hopefully you will read them. Hopefully you will giggle at least a little bit or like somebody. Joey needs friends, but yeah. So I came across Thomas Godfrey first because he submitted All Hail the Carrion King to the Fresh Meat feature. So if you look back in the backlog of the Fresh Meat feature, you can find the reading of his first chapter. But then just earlier last month, he sent in, I think it was last month, it might have been October. I think actually it might have been October, and I forgot about the email. But he sent an email saying that he had a new book coming out, The Dead Skin Mask, and he thought that I might be interested in reading it. So when people let me know about their books, if it fits into a genre or a description that I'm interested in, I actually like to go and read it. So one, that the author gets the money, and then two, so it doesn't feel like anybody is owed anything. I like to be as above the table as possible. So if I do pick up your book, I generally will pay you for it instead of expecting some sort of arc. But he sent it in and had a description that sounded interesting. And then Halo Studios did a book review that also made it sound interesting. And on top of that, Effie also did a video on his other book, All Hail the Carrion King. And so all of these ideas just made me interested in wanting to see what Thomas Godfrey had in his written works. And so during Thanksgiving, I read The Dead Skin Mask. And then within a week after that, I think it was in the next like 2 or 3 days, I read All Hail the Carrion King. And so I've got both of those. And so now I'm giving you this video to go and read these books during Christmas vacation or Christmas break or the long weekend, so that we can discuss the books, because that's the fun part. However, I will be getting into like discussion form and spoiling some things. So if you don't want them spoiled, go read the books and then come back, and then we can discuss like how our experiences varied and what our thoughts were. But other than that, we're going to get into this and be ready for the ride, because I've got some thoughts. So we're going to be starting with The Dead Skin Mask, which I actually think is Thomas Godfrey's second book, as it came out this year. And then I'm not sure when All Hail the Carrion King came out, but it came out first. So we're going to talk about Dead Skin Mask first, and then go to All Hail the Carrion King. And I'm going to do some comparisons between the two. At some point, they'll come in when they come in. So starting with The Dead Skin Mask, the synopsis is, the main character of this novel is named Mortimer, and he's a shelf stalker who is entirely displeased and disillusioned with life. Like, he is entirely done. Everything sucks. He wakes up, walks to work and from work, opining on how much the world sucks, all of the lies of everything. The city sucks, people suck, everyone is fake, and we're living in a world of Sodom and Gomorrah. Also, 1, 2, 3, 4... I declare a holy war. That is a phrase that you will run into a good handful of times in this book. He doesn't believe his coworkers are honest, but then again, he doesn't believe anybody is honest, even the girl who goes out of her way to talk to him every day at work. He's reading Crime and Punishment on his breaks, but he thinks that it's bunk literature that's only popular because someone with an ego and an air of authority said so, but it's meh to him. I don't know why he's not reading a different book. We never get any idea of what he considers to be good literature, because Crime and Punishment is the only book that's referenced throughout. Between his day job and opining on the world, he's also trying to become a published author himself. I think he specifically mentions poetry. He checks his email on the regular to see if he's got anything back from the publishers and agents that he's trying to court. Over time, he's rejected by all of them, giving him another thing to rant about: the fakeness of the publishing industry, where it's all ass-kissing and connections. Shortly after introducing himself, Mortimer goes for a walk on the beach where a moment of insanity takes hold of his body and he murders a homeless man at the pier. He disposes of the body quickly and spends the next couple of days concerned about whether he's going to be caught or not, in between giving his usual opinions on how the world works, what he hates about the world, and watching his email for acceptance letters from publishers or agents. The majority of the story is Mortimer waking up, going to work, opining angrily, worrying about if he'll ever get caught, then saying meh, he's never going to get caught because the guy that he killed was homeless and nobody cares about the homeless. He goes through existential crises throughout the novel, ultimately ending in another murder and, well, pretty much what you would expect from somebody who has a complete breakdown and disillusionment with reality. I'll leave you with that, though I will give spoilers later in my comments, but you can take a guess how a book called Dead Skin Mask ends when the character is totally disillusioned with life and wants out because even the girl that he thought might be different from everybody else is not actually different. So that's the basic concept of Dead Skin Mask. The name comes from this idea that everybody is wearing a mask of dead skin that's just your face to cover up the truth of who they are. So the first thing that I wanted to note about this book is I did laugh that he's a shelf stalker since I have my own shelf stalking character, but the difference between Mortimer's perspective and Jan's perspective could not be more different. They're pretty much on the opposite sides of the same spectrum, where Mortimer is totally done and disgusted with life and everything sucks, and Jan is so insanely drunk on life, he thinks it's beautiful to the point that he is naively idealistic. Like, he is lethally idealistic. He is dangerously idealistic is what Jan is. I just found it funny because it's not too often that you run into a character that is a Night Stalker, so hey, we got that in common. Getting to the characters, the character voice of Mortimer is very strong in this novel. I don't know if that's because Mortimer is a strong character on his own, or if it's because so much of what he says is heavily inspired by the author's personal views. One of the reasons that I immediately went and read the author's other book after reading this one was to try and gauge a sense of the author's voice to find the line between character and author. Because when you're writing, there's no way to really avoid putting in things that you care about. I think it was Steve Almond that said that we write about what we're obsessed with. And it's not always so obvious as shoving it in your face with character rants. Sometimes it's just the themes that constantly show up in your books or the way that you write characters. Because if you look at, say, my books and my catalog, you'll see that I do a lot with family, I do a lot with alienation, and I also do a lot with, like, outsiders in different ways. Like, you have Kelly as the outsider in Dead End Drive. You have Joey who feels like an outsider in her own house in Bodymore, and you have Jan who becomes an outsider when he goes to the United States. What I also do with alienation is stuff like in Cain and Abel, where Abel is so alienated and socially isolated and maladjusted from his peers and his family and everybody that he starts reality checking against himself and he falls into insanity. You've also got how family community changes your perspective and makes you stronger through the way that Dead End Drive ends, because it's the unit that makes it and not the people that are in it for themselves. You also see that in Bodymore, where the only reason that Joey is able to heal and to move on is because she's got a community around her and she allows herself to be a community instead of a person of one. And then the same thing happens with Jan, where the only reason that he is able to escape the government is because he's got family that cares about him. You see Alex shows up to try to help him, and there's just a community. And so I explore and use those ideas a lot. You can also see how I feel about relationships, or the way that I view relationships, through the way that my characters in my novel have relationships with one another. So I was reading others of Godfrey's books so that I could try to gauge what he cared about and what was important to him. And a continuing theme between the two of them was, one, food is disgusting. I would definitely say that I got the vibe that the food rants were rants specifically from the author and then exaggerated, because you also see those rants in All Hail the Carrion King, and you also see something in both of these books about how society has fallen, the West has fallen, and so that feels like an opinion on current culture. And then in All Hail the Carrion King, the main character specifically says that the West is in a culture war and that he chose the appearance of a jester to fight in the culture war. So I feel like the idea of the fallen society, of the disgust with society, and with the fakeness of everything is part of the author's perspective, but how much of the ranting is Mortimer's insanity that gets carried away, I'm not entirely sure. Which can make it difficult how much of this I'm supposed to take as serious and how much I'm supposed to take as satire, if that. But that's a separate thing. While I think the author's perspective is loudly implanted into both of the books, I think Mortimer takes it to an exaggerated frenzy for obvious reasons because he's a crazy person. Amber is a good counterbalance to Mortimer because she is so much more mild and so much more normal than the main character. However, for the most part, this novel isn't about any of the side characters, and it doesn't really feature them much. They're not really developed, and that's kind of unfortunate in my opinion because it could have turned these characters into perfect examples of what Mortimer could have been if he hadn't lost himself totally. Like Amber could have been his ideal for a girl, but he just picks and picks and picks at the worst possible things that make him insane because he can't focus on anything else. And he finds those little tiny annoyances to be huge, giant things. And that's one of the great things about doing first-person perspective and having an unreliable narrator is that narrator can pick at things that don't make any sense to the reader as long as you're kind of playing with this is their perspective. Like Joey picks up stuff all the time and exaggerates stuff all the time, assuming what people are thinking. But that's not really what they're thinking. She's just assuming that stuff on them. Like when she's interacting with Rocky and everything that he does, she's like, he is trying to play me. He's being insincere, but you can watch his actions. And the reader is like, but is he though? Or do you have a chip on your shoulder? So I think the side characters could have had so much potential for how they could have affected Mortimer and how Mortimer could have completely misread them, but they weren't really developed. Like even to the point where the roommate that Mortimer had didn't even have a name. He was just called the roommate. And then later in the book, there was a character that was just called the hero cop when he appeared. Like no bother to being given a name. And in some ways, this made the book feel more like a morality play because these characters were just in place to fill a role for the main character to opine on, to share his knowledge or his perspective with the reader on as the vessel or receiver of said information. And for me, that was kind of a weaker choice just because the characters weren't developed to strengthen exactly what it was that Mortimer was trying to say and show the world. Style and perspective choices. I found it kind of an odd decision to write this in first person of him actively doing things. It was first person present, which if you read my books, that's kind of what I like to do. So no hate on first person perspective, but there's a moment early on in the book when he breaks the fourth wall and says that this is a notebook and you are reading this notebook in post. And I think if it was written in the past tense to give the vibe that this was a diary of events as he did them, as we watched him roll into insanity, it would have been better and had been less jarring when the book switched to address the audience via the notebook. But because it only addressed the audience in one section in like chapter 1 or chapter 2 and then never did it again, it was really, really weird. And also since that journal mechanic only comes up in the first chapter and is never mentioned again, it feels like it's not the character actually opining as he lives his day, but writing his manifesto and you found it in post, which again, would have been better if the whole thing was written in the past tense as if it was a memoir or a manifest. That could have been a really, really interesting way to see this. It could have also been insanely chilling to read this as a manifesto, maybe even with a prologue where it's the news story of having found this guy in the bathroom with his face cut off and this book laying on his coffee table. And so then the whole rest of the book is going through that manifesto after he'd been found having committed suicide. Plot. This book doesn't really have a plot. So I don't really think that this book had much of a plot. I'd lean more on calling it literary fiction than horror, and there's also not really any character development from the way that I experienced the book. I think it tries to do character study, but it never actually really got there for me because the character remained exactly the same from the beginning to the end as he showed us. Because the character remained the exact same from the beginning to the end of the book. For the most part, the book read like a walking simulator, taking the reader from place to place that would inspire the correct political essay. After reading All Hail the Carrion King, I feel a little more comfortable saying this because both books shared this structure of walking somewhere to display something, and the narrator or guide will then explain to you what this all is or how disgusting it is, turning both books into a version of a morality play. Now, if you're not familiar with morality plays, they were old versions of shows or plays that were put on by churches to teach lessons. And they put up different stages, usually between the different columns of the churches, that had different stages that would teach different lessons or that would focus on something different that they wanted the audience to pick up on. Maybe one stage would be hell, maybe one stage would be heaven, maybe one stage would be about somebody stealing something and then learning the values or the sin of that theft. Each stage had its own story, and there were typically multiples of them when the morality plays were going on. Both this book and All Hail the Carrion King do this kind of staging where you go somewhere, you express something, then you go to the next thing, and then you express the next message. That said, we don't see an evolution in Mortimer's thoughts. We don't see him evolve from normalcy or barely keeping it together and playing the game in chapter 1 to changing and seeing the new world after murdering someone in chapter 2 as Faith gets pulled away because nobody cares or people are making jokes or he's just, the facade is wearing off. He's got the same essays throughout the whole of the book, before he kills somebody, after he kills somebody, all the way up to the end. Everything is fake, food is fake, he talks about the food a lot. The West has fallen, everyone's a degenerate, cities are garbage, and people are living in Sodom and Gomorrah. Also, everyone's a liar. Let's just continue to say everyone's a liar. For me, this needed some kind of peaks and valleys that allowed the character to show differences or to show like a slow moment or where he still had hope and then to come back. But everything was negative and everything was a message and everything was a critique. And this is where I think the prologue opening with a news story about a man dead in his bathroom with his face cut off and his handwritten manifesto on the coffee table in the living room could have been a really interesting place to start. Give his roommate an interview with the news people and going like, I don't know, that guy was going crazy and I tried to be at the house as little as possible so I didn't have to talk to him. Like anything to start framing this so then that we could go on this ride of who was this crazy person that cut off his face that his roommate then had to find. Because clearly, unless his roommate abandoned him totally and just didn't tell him, it was going to be his roommate or his landlord who found him when the rent wasn't paid. But can you imagine reading a book that is the manifesto of somebody that's already killed themselves and you're like, what brought them to this? They left this out and left this message of their dead body that they have now ascended. Especially if he wrote something in his blood as he was dying. Like you could do so much with however you set up that prologue. It could have been insane. Structure. From sentence to chapter to character, the structure started out unique but became repetitive as time went on. Essays were repeated, the poison of the food was repeated. I know that I'm repeating that now because it was in there so many times. Every chapter, the character went to work. Every chapter started and ended with the character waking up and going to sleep. This part I didn't mind so much as it being a character trait that the character was going through routine and just going through the motions of life. But then I read All Hail the Carrion King, and it also opened and closed pretty much every chapter with waking up and going to sleep. So that felt less like a Mortimer trait and more like an author's storytelling style trait, if that makes sense. And there were also sentences of this book that felt much more repetitive on a sentence structure level than Carrion King, and maybe that's because this was first person. So there were many more, I did this, I did that, I went here, I did a thing, but Carrion King was in third person and had a secondary character to play off of. So the prose on this could have used more sharpening in the line edit phase to give more variation to movement and the way that the character spoke. Some of the repetitive ideas that I specifically got tired of reading were God is dead and we shat in his corpse, God is dead and we raped him, God is dead so many times and we did something to his body. I don't feel like the book justified being that level of mentioning that many times. But I think that becomes an issue of repetition in general, because typically you use repetition to highlight something or to emphasize something, but when everything is repeated, then nothing is emphasized anymore. So then it just reads like rambling and ranting without a filter. Character arc. I think I already said this a second ago, but really quickly, I wanted to mention the character speaking as though he transcended and changed opinion, finally seeing the world for the disgusting place that it is, and how he was turning into a serial killer because he couldn't stand the insanity since he'd seen the truth. But he was speaking the same before and after the murder in the second chapter. I think it would have been more effective to show him changing disposition and opinions to become more extreme as he got more and more exposure to certain things. One option could have been witnessing a murder and thinking that it'd come up somewhere, but then nobody cared. Like, he didn't even have to kill somebody in the second chapter. He could have been at the beach and saw somebody kill somebody and then been like, holy shit, and then nobody talked about it. And he was like, did that even happen? Nobody is saying anything. Does anybody care about this missing man? Like, literally no one is talking about him. You could have even had newscasters there that were there talking about the ocean and the pollution in the ocean because we care. And then somebody over there gets murdered, and these news people that saw that story happen just, they don't even say anything. Like, that could have been a wake-up call to him, and you could take this to such a satirical level of how much society is put on blinders to the stuff that is making him crazy. And then it just becomes this exercise in how to get people's attention so they respond. And that starts breaking him out of this falsehood that everybody is living in and seeing everything decay around him. Like, that's just one option. Where it could have escalated to him killing somebody, and then Amber could have been the final nail in the coffin since he thought that she cared, and it turns out she doesn't. Because the character doesn't show a logical pattern, nor does he show, like, movement and character development, the character lacked logic for me. Now, I know that he's insane. Take it from me, I know, but logical doesn't mean rational, and insanity still has logic behind it. There's still a reason of, I'm gonna cut off my arm because I think there are fire ants in my fingernails. Like, it doesn't have to be reality, but there does have to be sense and reason behind why somebody does what they do. The character didn't do that for me. And I feel like him starting out with hope and then finally saying, I'm done trying to be a writer, would have been a good place for him to start messing with the world, or like I said, with that murder, and slowly inch his way closer to killing someone until he realizes how little stuff matters, and then he ultimately kills himself. Because also, how can you say, I think it was the second chapter, might have been the end of the first chapter, he said something about how publishing industry is all just bullshit and it's all ass-kissing when he gets the first message back about his manuscript, but then he continues to be hopeful for the rest of the book about his other agents accepting his manuscript. How can you already have the opinion that all of this is bullshit, but then still continually check your computer obsessively and be like, I'm gonna get a yes, I'm gonna get a yes, I'm gonna get a yes? You either have given up or you haven't. And so it didn't have the progression that I needed it to have in order to have power and to show anything other than to be frustrated rants that this then became the venue for. There's definitely compelling ideas here, but for me, it didn't build into a story to make it anything maybe than a couple strung together political essays. Additionally, because so much of it feels like personal rant, much of it doesn't feel like it's set up within the confines of interactions or experiences that the character has had, so more of it feels unrelated to fiction than anything else. I'm gonna get into some contradictions later with some of the political ranting. So descriptions. In both this book and All Hail the Carrion, the author is actually very skilled description, especially with body horror, terrible things, and descriptions of monsters. He is also very successful in descriptions of disgusting and disturbing things while having the imagination to create an absolute horror show. The violent actions in here are also well described, albeit they lacked character motivation, which goes back up to my complaints about characterization. So talking about the contradictions in the character, because I never got a sense of who Mortimer actually was, I never got a sense of what he actually believed or what he found important. That, in turn, made some of his rantings seem counterintuitive and contradictory. So that's not to say that he didn't take a stance on some things, but he didn't have a strong perspective on a lot of them because he was wishy-washy and didn't show the progression of his thoughts. One of these times was when he was ranting about how academics, scholars, and artists are useless to society compared to blue-collar workers that actually add something to society. He also says that stocking the shelves actually returns something to society, so that is a job worth doing. However, he's still pursuing being a writer, somehow believing that he has a higher purpose than the artists he previously ditched, and that he's got something more meaningful to say than the other artists that he said are worthless to society. But he then says that stocking shelves is a job that could be done by monkeys, and he also says that monkeys could bang on a computer to create Shakespeare. So this guy is black-pilled on everything, and nothing is worth doing, period. Giving back to society is useless because everyone in society sucks, and blue-collar work is more, matters more than artistry. However, both of them could be done by monkeys, so who gives a shit? I could see in the end why he'd kill himself, but we didn't actually get there to feel it. He always started out this way, and then everything was shit-talking unless he was gonna make a point, and then like 3 pages later, inflate his ego, and then 3 pages later, contradict himself from what he just said 10 pages ago. So I ended up not knowing what he valued. Did he change his mind on what he valued? Did he just consider himself better than other artists? I don't really know. Since we didn't really get to see the character shift while he was actively doing everything in the book, I wasn't sure where his actual beliefs lied and then what actually changed any of his beliefs as he went through the book. He also ranted against how the rich don't drink soda pop or eat poison food, while the plebs are all so dumb that they just eat garbage and candy and fast food And so they're not deserving, but also the rich are evil in relation to the types of food that they choose to eat. It was just further characterization that I wasn't sure what the reasoning behind was, and the messiness of the rants just made it feel more like it was not solid what this character believed. Again, it's just kind of random rants thrown in there instead of this character definitely believes this and he has this chip on his shoulder. It's an opportunistic sort of rant. He also says that he doesn't believe in God while making biblical diatribes throughout the entirety of the book, and everything is about living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's repeated how this is a holy war multiple times. This eventually turns into what feels like the author's credo because it's said so many times in both of the books. Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm just giving you what I observed. That being said, I just wish that there was stronger characterization here because I think that this piece has a lot of power behind the idea, but it just didn't get developed to the point that I would have liked it or that it was cohesive. Final additional thoughts. I wish crime and punishment had been used and worked into the storyline rather than just being referenced throughout the book as he goes to the break room, grabs the book, looks at crime and punishment, and then closes it and walks away. It was just another detail that felt like personal choice, but it wasn't actually built into the story, and I feel like the author may have had a purpose for choosing it, but unless you knew outside of the book, you wouldn't know why that book was picked. I wish that there had also been a final climax that had showed a 180 that Mortimer pulled. He ranted continuously about how society doesn't value life, and nobody in his neighborhood values life, and in turn, he devalued life and insulted humanity, kept insulting his neighbors, and killed people while doing nothing to amend the issues that he was noticing. While doing that, he just got more and more bitter while being a participant in the things that he hated. And that in turn just made his rantings appear not only black-pilled and depressed, but also self-righteous and selfish where he had no moral code. He goes after others for not caring about nature, beauty, and humanity, while he is also not caring about any of those things. Moving on to All Hail the Carrion King. A brief synopsis of that book is this novel opens with a jester washing up on shore being greeted by a couple of sailors or fishermen. After speaking with them, he is pointed toward a nearby village where he enters the tavern and watches a couple of the clowns/stand-up comedians that are local to the area. At least one of which insults the Carrion King. A couple of agents, which are servants of the Carrion King, enter and cut out tongues of those who mocked the king and leave. There was one jester named Isaac who got away without having his tongue cut out, and that's because he used sarcasm, and the angels don't understand sarcasm. After talking to the jester, Isaac's invited to travel with the jester to the west to meet and perform for the Carrion King. This is only what everyone has always dreamed of because the Carrion King is able to make dreams come true. It's the opportunity of a lifetime, so of course he's going to take it. After saying goodbyes to his family, he meets the jester and they set off on their journey to the west. The two of them head through the woods and nature, a train, a couple of villages, and a city of glass toward the palace of the Carrion King. The duo run into various issues, including angels, knights, the king of glass, temptation, and a scarlet dress, a theater run by a one-eyed angel, and so much more. Through the journey, we learn that the jester is immortal and a longtime adversary of the Carrion King. His imperative is to bring a challenger to the Carrion King who is going to be able to fight against him without dropping to his knees at the desire to become famous through the power that the Carrion King holds. Upon meeting the Carrion King, though, Isaac is offered the world if only he will fall to his knees. And will he? What is your guess? How did that go for brief? I know usually we're here for like an hour and a half as I do plot summaries. The descriptions in this book, as in Dead Skin Mask, the descriptions in this book were well done. The monsters, buildings, and disgusting nature of everything was the strongest skill of this author. He seemed to take particular attention to making things disgusting and disturbing stand out, which is perfect for descriptive horror. I mean, really, I complained about Grady Hendrix's inability to do descriptions or create atmosphere in Southern Book Club. I'd actually say that Thomas Godfrey's descriptions of angels, horror, creatures, and the locations of this book far surpass the skill that Grady showed in that novel. Stakes. So in this story, the central characters are the Jester and Isaac. The Jester is like a cosmic supernatural being fighting against the idea of the evil ruler. However, he can't fight the evil personally. He has to find a human that will reject the offer of the devil, basically, and he's forever in a fight until he can find someone who will reject the devil, that is the Carrion King. In the beginning, we're told by the Jester that the angels won't attack him. However, the knights might because they aren't held back by the same things that hold the angels back. However, the knights are also supposed to be subordinates to the angels and the Carrion King. So if the Carrion King or the angels pass down orders that say don't attack this person, you'd think that the knights would also be required to listen to that, or, you know, they would get offed by the king. As the story progresses, the Jester and Isaac constantly run into knights, and the warning that I was given doesn't actually hold, since knights continually attack the two of them. Maybe there were rules somewhere that I missed, or they weren't stated, but I didn't find it a satisfactory answer that these knights would just do whatever they wanted and continue to attack who was considered the guests of the Carrion King, including the fact that Isaac got a letter from the Carrion King inviting him to the palace. It didn't make sense to me that servants of the Carrion King would attack his invited guest. Since we know from the beginning that the Jester can't die and is all-powerful, then there really aren't any stakes for the two of them being attacked, which also made the fight scenes seem almost pointless. They were always going to come out on top because the Jester would protect Isaac and the Jester was invincible. And this can work just fine in books and storytelling, because there's like, you generally expect the main character to get out alive on the other side. But also we're dealing with, there's not going to be any stakes because the Jester is a supernatural being that is way above the pay grade of the angels and the knights. So I don't understand what the fight scenes were for, other than to give the Jester a chance to cut a bunch of heads off and then be covered in blood and giggle at killing people, which, if you saw my girl bossing video, like, that's not where badassery comes. Killing people is not where badassery comes from. If there's no real danger involved in Isaac and the Jester, then the stake comes down to Isaac and the temptations around him at each location they pass through, as well as his naivety basically feeding him to these temptations. And that is a great stake. That is a great moral question. However, there's never really any opportunity to see this, because despite how the Carrion King was supposed to be offering something beautiful, and despite how the Carrion King and his cohorts are selling lies, Isaac's always seeing through the temptations as just disgusting. They never appeared tempting, whether it was the nasty food in the city or the city life in general being drab, or Isaac running into his ex-boyfriend at the end of the book, who was just being a dick all the way through, rather than trying to tempt him with, "I've changed and I'm here for you, baby," and like telling Isaac everything that he wanted to hear and being the man that Isaac always wanted him to be. So when everything that is nasty looks nasty from the beginning, then there is no temptation to take it. There are two specific ways that I could have seen this being super interesting and the ideas behind it. One is that every new place is treated as a manner of moral or virtuous temptation. Greed, lust, you know, sloth is the first town that they come across, because what's the best way to stop somebody from coming to fight you? Well, getting them to not even go on the journey to begin with is a great way. So the first inn that the Jester and Isaac stop at could have been a test of the sloth. Then, not staying, Isaac could have received the message from the Carrion King, and every place after that would have been temptation turned up. The temptation should have either been convincing to actually make Isaac want to partake, like Pinocchio on the island, or we could have viewed the city through the eyes of the Jester, seeing the lies, but Isaac didn't see those lies, and then we could have seen the disgust the Jester felt watching Isaac partake in these nasty things and not listening to him when he's like, "Don't eat that burger, it's disgusting." Think of the trip if you're like watching this character eat this nasty, nasty burger and your Jester is like, "Dude, don't do that." And he's like, "What's wrong with this?" And then you're just, you know, he bites into it and all these worms and pus like go out and you're like, "Oh my gosh." But Isaac sees nothing wrong with it because he's fallen into the temptation. Either of these could have effectively showed the truth versus the illusion that the population was living under, and Isaac could have resulted in either seeing the Carrion King's true form at the end or not. Or he sees the truth of the Carrion King but still gets on his knees because he's seen the truth, but he doesn't want to deal with the truth or acknowledge the truth. So worshiping and going back to blindness is the best way that he knows to deal with this, and it's what most people choose to do. Without ever actually describing any of the temptations in a positive way and showing the true reason of Isaac to be tempted, though, it took away any bite of any of the temptations throughout the book, and the decision that Isaac makes at the end doesn't really make any sense because he saw that all of it is fake, and he had literal people in the story tell him that it was fake and that it was a mistake to listen to the Carrion King, that he's not going to give you everything that he promises, and yet Isaac still picks the Carrion King after all of this. World building. I liked the world building and ideas behind this book, but I don't feel like I got enough of it. For the most part, the novel felt especially like an old school morality play, like I mentioned earlier, with each city or stop being a sort of location for a challenge for the Jester to then explain the decay of the world and the corruption of humanity to Isaac. Where in Dead Skin Mask, the narrator spoke directly to the reader, in this novel, Isaac is the vessel for the reader to ride in and listen to the Jester inform him on the world that we live in. Sometimes that didn't make make much sense because Isaac didn't seem to have a grasp on any part of the world that he actually lived in. It made sense for him to not understand how the city or Carrion King's domain worked up close since he'd never been there, but he had a church in his hometown with a Carrion King in the stained glass window, and he had no idea why that guy had that name. Like, he also still had to ask about the knights and the angels. These are things that even if you didn't know the truth, he should have known something like the lore or mythology that is commonly known in the area and why everybody worships the Carrion King. But he had to ask the jester, what does any of this mean and why is he even named that? Dude, you've got a church! And then even the jester just goes, he just picked that name. Where is the lore? The world also accepted the eyeless angels and other supernatural creatures like the Gray Things, but then had a hard time accepting that the jester was also supernatural. I didn't understand why. Everyone knew the eyeless creatures served the Carrion King, but for some reason, Isaac still wanted to go and entertain him. Why? The jester went to the Carrion King's church in Isaac's town immediately after meeting Isaac. Why? The first angels and knights that we run into after leaving the town said that they were told to stand down, and the jester still got attacked on the journey. Why? They walked through the woods to get from Isaac's town to the new town because the streets were too dangerous, but we were told that the jester wouldn't be attacked, and also the main character said that he was going to make that journey with his human boyfriend. And so it can't be that dangerous because they were just going to ride the normal path. So what was the problem here? Much of the choices in travel and altercations felt more like they were there to explain a message rather than actually being part of world building. Sometimes it even felt like the world building was forced to take a backseat specifically because we couldn't make temptations actually look good for a second, because that would be wrong. So as the reader, I was never actually convinced of any of the stakes or any of the realities that the world was trying to present, and I don't know why this choice was made. I'm also not sure why at the end of the first chapter we had such heavy involvement with all of Isaac's family when they weren't particularly important and it didn't benefit the story in any way. Isaac's character had a really long goodbye with everyone, and they never come up again in the story after that. I think a lot of stories today, both traditional and indie, are getting stuck on this idea of writing a message and being meaningful instead of actually just telling a story with the values built in through the ideas. Thus, it's turning into a heavy-handed work of morals, historical references, and mythology instead of telling a story with inspiration from those things that weaves it into the universe of the book that we're being handed. Character motivations. Since we spend so much time with the jester and Isaac, we should have clear motivations for who they are and what they want. It should be obvious fairly quickly. Isaac wants to become a big-time entertainer, and the jester wants to defeat the Carrion King. Because we know their motivations, their actions should support their motivations. However, the jester doesn't remain at Isaac's side, nor teach him how to identify and resist temptations. He says that he's there to teach Isaac how to resist, but continually takes him into the belly of multiple beasts without ever warning him about the dangers of what he will face, how to build strong character, or any alternative to giving in beyond to die on your feet instead of living on your knees. It's suggested that the jester used to raise other people's kids with morals in the cornfield, but we never see him instilling those virtues in Isaac. Instead, he murders without remorse or hesitation, giggles about it, and moves on. There's a reason that he keeps losing, and instead of it being a moral failing on the part of a human, it's more like the jester's just feeding humanity to the Carrion King without even trying anything but to show the Carrion King's destruction. Meanwhile, Isaac wants fame. But when offered the chance to go to the West, first he says, I want to, and then I don't know on the same page. It could have been written as hesitation or fear, but I don't feel like it showed enough of the internal struggle for that. Then as the story went on in seeing that Carrion King's destruction, he rejected it and said everything was nasty and he didn't want to be a part of it, when he should have been captured by the Carrion King's rule, by the temptations, if that was the direction that it was going to go in the end, or to just continually up and up and up it, and to show the weakness as the temptation gets stronger and Isaac gets worn down. Another two characters where the lack of motivation stands out. One was the one-eyed angel who first invited Isaac to perform at his theater and then tells him to be out by morning once the performance is over. But then when Isaac is leaving the next day, the one-eyed angel says, please come back, I'd love to have you. Does he need to leave because your master would hate to know that he's here, or is he welcome to come again? What is this angel's loyalty and how does this work? It's not really shown. Another is the King of Glass, who traded everything to get his power. However, when asked if he would do it again, he tells Isaac that he wouldn't and that he regretted it. Is this man captivated by the nightmare that he was given by the Carrion King or no? This feels like something that someone who has bowed to the power wouldn't necessarily recognize because he's sold out. It also doesn't seem to make sense for Isaac to be hearing this right before going to see the Carrion King and then just to give in to the Carrion King's power because he's already heard that it's all a massive lie. Everything that he's seen is disgusting. The guy that he talked to said that it all sucks, so why are there even any choices other than to push the message of moral failure and black pillory? Actions should echo motivations though, even if they change. Without the action behind the words of I want, then the compulsion of somebody doing something reads hollow. This is a complete side tangent, but parents and their kids talking about sex. So I'm bringing it up because it's been a few books now, and I need to know what the mistakes think about this situation. Parents making jovial and casual conversations about banging their kids' moms to their kids, or banging their kids' friends, or just talking about sex openly with their kids, like having sex. Like Swanee was talking about her cousin having sex with her dad, and do I need to talk to him about treating you better? And then Swanee's dad talking to Swanee about banging her friends when she's 18. Is this normal in your house? Because the number of times that I keep seeing people getting into casual conversations about their personal sex, not sex education, but personal sexual history with their parents in these books is bizarre. The dad talked very, very casually about taking the news of his son leaving to the son's mother and then having sex with her that night, specifically to give her another child, popping a baby inside of her to cover for the fact that she has a child that is moving on. Why is everybody talking to their children about inseminating their wives or their friends? Maybe I'm the weird one. My wish list for this book. I wish I'd gotten to see Isaac show off his daring personality and why the Jester had chosen him. Even at 50% mark, with the Jester talking up Isaac's spunky spirit, we still hadn't actually seen him show that strength and spirit that the Jester admired and was talking up. We didn't get to see him struggle against the temptations and say no, to the point that in this point in the story, we're like, yes, great job, oh no, the temptations have gotten stronger in this situation. Also, why are you putting a woman in scantily clad clothing in his room? You're going with the woman of Babylon, but he's gay. It's not an actual temptation if it's so far out of his zone that he's not even, she doesn't even have supernatural sexual appeal to this guy that makes him double think himself because she is a supernatural being. I would have also liked to see each of the stops made in this book be a different kind of temptation where Isaac learned either to resist or embrace the temptation, and it was all a threat for survival. This would have given a choice at the end much more punch if he actually had to struggle and overcome and learn things from the Jester, and the Jester had to chase him around because Isaac was getting away, wanting to do these things, instead of, the Jester kind of wandering off and then Isaac having to come and find him later. But instead, we mostly got the Jester fighting people while Isaac asked questions, and no struggle for Isaac up to the end. The problem with the morality play is every character that Isaac actually talks to about the trade that they've made with the devil says that it's not worth it. The world he sees that belongs to the Carrion King is disgusting from the start. Much like with the Deadskin Mask, there's never a time when the narrator is not conflicted or accepting. He's never dazzled by any of this before reaching the Carrion King, which makes the rejection easy. Everyone has always looked bad, and the main character is told that it's bad, and he agrees. What would have been stronger for messaging is if everything looked razzle-dazzle, getting closer and closer to the Carrion King. You've got all of these temptations. You're seeing the beauty of the trick through Isaac's eyes, while the Jester is trying to warn him, do not touch it. Do not believe what you see with your eyes. And Isaac might be making some bad decisions through this, but he's more or less resisting. Then, once you get to the end of the book, whether Isaac makes the better decision or not, the narrative changes to describe things that were once beautiful as now disgusting. The feast of steaks that he put in his mouth now tastes like shit, and it's revealed that because he's made that decision, or the opposite, where he sees through the mirage of that steak dinner. If everything already looks terrible, then there's no decision to be made and no temptation toward the Carrion King's offer. Though, just imagine that they finally reached the Carrion King's castle, and it's so beautiful. And Isaac is like, I thought that you said it wasn't going to be like this. I thought you said it was ugly and disgusting, because everything has dazzled him. Hope has dazzled him. The ending is right there, and the jester is like, don't be fooled by your naive, wanting eyes. It is not what it seems. And then, Isaac do what Isaac do. But instead, we get the warning, that's what stories do. They make things sound special. Look at the one that we're in right now. It dresses itself up with fantasy and wonder, but strip it all away, and what are you left with? A young man deciding if he should sell his soul for the taste of power. Aside from this line being meta, or as... It doesn't really work because there is no mirage within this story. It is always a morality play. Isaac never falls for the sham, and sometimes it felt like the narrator was so biased against what he was advocating against that he would never allow it to look like a positive thing. The disgusting nature of what was happening in the castle also could have been an excellent example of how to show the proof of the nastiness that Isaac refused to see. If we were allowed to look at the temptation as nice and desirable, and then he dropped to his knees to join the Carrion King, and the facade was pulled away all around Isaac all at one moment and turned into debauchery, as was described when he first entered the castle, then, since we'd made that deal with the Carrion King, he has to partake, or he doesn't see the disgust in it anymore. However you want to deal with that situation, it would have shown the contrast of what we saw and what was the trick versus what was hidden that the jester tried to warn about. On the nose writing. I like a lot of ideas in here. I also don't mind necessarily on the nose ideas. Cutting out the tongue, the eyeless followers, the descriptions of the world, the city of glass, the naivety of the outer areas of the corruption and the stink of the inside, the decay that comes with the trade with the devil. But some of the writing felt a little more on the nose because of the world building not being completely developed and being stuck on the message. The things that stood out the most to me, though, were what it felt like literally a 2019 Jester reference, is the Jester saying, I chose this form from the pyre, for the war that we now fight is a quiet one, a cultural one, and the Jester is the perfect warrior for a culture war. That is a direct quote. I don't care if you're left or right or an extreme centrist. I'm not reading fiction for political stuff to be shoved at me in the guise of fiction. And I put on a clown face to fight the culture war is just not something that I can deal with right now, and I'm not really interested in political content. Being overtly shoved into my books. I will read for the story, and your story is obviously going to contain your perspective, but I'm not part of this woke, anti-woke reading. I want the characters. Give me the characters. Formatting, very briefly, the formatting in both books could use a bit of help to be a little more professional looking. If that's something that could bother you as a reader, then maybe keep that in mind when you pick up the book. The interlude. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this actually irritated me. Let's talk about the single most thing that was something I didn't like in either of these books. The interlude in All Hail the Carrion King. Obviously, everything in my reviews is totally personal preference, but especially this, I don't like to see authors' hands all over the insides of their books. I don't like seeing the author force something or interrupt the book or push it in a particular direction. Like if you looked at my Grady Hendrix book review, I talked about how his fingerprints were all over the book because he was shoving Patty around everywhere, and he even put on a wig to become a character in his own book so that he could tell her where to go. Like, I hate it when the author intervenes into the story. I am there for the characters. So just before the final chapter in this book, there is a single paragraph called the interlude where the author interjects, interrupting the story just to tell you that, hey, you could put this book down right now, not continue and not miss anything. You know, you can make up your own decisions on how this book ends, or you can probably guess the correct decision based on the hints laid throughout, but you won't put the book down because the fates had determined that you won't put the book down. I'm sorry, but if I wasn't intending to do a book review for this book, I actually would have put the book down from that because I felt like that was arrogant. And anytime an author stops the story to remind you that you are reading a story and it's not about characters within the story, I think it's detrimental to the reading experience. You've pulled me away from the characters and the setting and the world building, and now I'm more likely to question your mechanics and your choices and why are we here. Personally, I think it's a bad decision to disrupt the reader needlessly in any sort of way, whether that's, I'm going to put a trigger warning at the start of this first chat, as a part of this random chapter in the middle of the book. Like, don't break the character experience for me. But that is a personal preference for reading. But a note like this specifically, where it's like mocking the reader, I don't like it. Sorry. Let me know what your thoughts are. But Go read the book, tell me your thoughts, because I need to know. In the end, between these two books, I think they have potential, and I think I liked Carrion King better because it had more character setting and creation in it than The Dead Skin Mask, which was more political and social ramblings connected by walking between scenery to prompt what the character said next. The author has a creative point of view and a dark vision. That much is very clear. He's great at describing the worlds that he sees, but now I think it's more about taking his skill set and interpreting it into a cohesive storyline with characters that follow through and represent the ideas that he has, because he is not short of ideas. If you're interested in the ideas of either of these books, like I said, I highly recommend you check out one or both. Come back and have a discussion, experiencing them for yourself. Otherwise, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Looking forward to the discussion. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend. Don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry. Flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?